3 young nurses vanished during their overnight shift at Central Crest Hospital, leaving behind only silence and a city gripped by fear. For half a year, their families searched in vain until a sewer technician uncovered a sealed hatch beneath the city, hiding more than just pipes. What he found would unravel a secret buried for decades and expose a truth more disturbing than anyone imagined. The rain came down in sheets, washing the streets of Oak Run clean of their usual noises, save for the occasional crack of thunder and the howl of the wind. Central Crest Medical Center, a massive, aging building that loomed like a forgotten cathedral in the center of town, flickered in and out of the storm's wrath. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed weakly in long corridors that twisted like veins through its heart. On the third floor, Elena Morris glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Her fingers drummed against the counter at the nurse's station. The storm had killed the Wi-Fi again, and she couldn't even check patient records properly. Zoe Tran emerged from the break room with 2 styrofoam cups of coffee, her usually lively eyes dulled with exhaustion. 3 more hours, she muttered, handing 1 cup to Elena. Then we're free. Dahlia Kim joined them seconds later, still in her scrubs stained from the ER shift. Free from what? Rain or this hellhole of a night shift? She asked with a wry smirk. They had all started working at Central Crest around the same time and had grown closer with every patient saved and every bureaucratic nightmare endured. Elena worked in dermatology, but the department was chronically short-staffed, so she often floated to wherever needed. Tonight she had been reassigned to the ICU, a place Zoe knew too well from pediatrics. Dahlia, always the adrenaline junkie, had pulled under ER double. The storm outside began to worsen, and with it, the hospital's aging infrastructure groaned under pressure. At precisely 12:13 AIEM, the power flickered, then cut entirely for 3 long seconds before emergency lights buzzed on. The hallways turned red from the glow of the backup system. Elena's pager vibrated. Code blue, ICU room 322. She exchanged a quick glance with Zoe, who nodded. I'll come with. Dahlia peeled off toward the ER just as the overhead system crackled, but instead of a voice, it emitted static. Elena hesitated at the elevator before deciding to take the stairs instead. Central Crest was known for its creaky, unreliable elevators, especially during bad weather. As she and Zoe ascended to the ICU, their shadows stretched long and warped on the damp concrete walls. Room 320 slashed long and warped on the damp concrete walls. Room 322 was empty. The bed was made, untouched. Elena frowned. False alarm? Zoe checked the chart. No one's been in this room for 2 days. Then the lights blinked again. The intercom whispered static. A thump echoed from somewhere below. What was that? Elena asked. Zoe turned to answer, but then paused. Wait, where's your idea? Elena reached for her chest, where her badge usually hung. It was gone. Meanwhile, in the ER, Dahlia was treating a patient with a deep forehead gash when the room temperature suddenly dropped. Her breath fogged, despite the room supposedly being heated. The patient began mumbling incoherently in Spanish, repeating the word bajo, under. Dahlia froze when the lights cut again, this time staying out longer. When they flickered back on, the patient was unconscious, and the machines around him blinked a strange, repeated sequence of numbers. April 16th, 99. A date. At 1:06 a.m., all 3 women stopped responding to pages. By 1:12, they had each vanished from their respective areas, leaving behind only personal items. Elena's dropped ID outside room 3122, Zoe's half-drunk coffee sitting on the ICU desk, and Dahlia's open patient chart, still recording vital signs, with no nurse present. The storm continued to rage outside. Security reviewed camera footage the next morning, only to find that all feeds between 12:10 a.m. and 1:30 a.m. were corrupted, distorted static, flickers of movement, and at one point, what looked like a white figure drifting down the ICU hallway. The police were notified by 6 a.m., and by 9, search teams were combing through every level of the hospital, from the rooftop H-access to the sealed basement. But no one found anything. No blood, no broken doors, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the storm had simply erased them. The press labeled it the Central Crest disappearances. Some whispered of abduction. Others believed the hospital's history, decades-old rumors of unethical experiments in sealed rooms, had come back to haunt it. The administration held a press conference claiming full cooperation with authorities, but avoided mentioning the camera blackout or the whispered code April 16, '99 that had shown up in 3 separate ER machines. Only the families clung to those details, and among them was a woman named Miriam Morris, who had once worked in that very hospital. She hadn't stepped foot inside Central Crest for 20 years. But when she was handed her daughter's ID badge, found inches from the ICU stairwell, something deep in her memory stirred. A smell, a sound, the same dread she had felt once before, in 1999. She didn't say anything to the officers that morning, but as she stared at the grainy screenshot from the corrupted camera footage of a faint figure draped in white, hair floating as if underwater, she whispered to herself, "It's happening again." Detective Samuel Rohr sat behind the flickering light of his desktop screen, eyes narrowed as he scrolled through Alina Morse's hospital-issued email account. Most of the messages were routine, shift swaps, patient records, forwarded memes between the nurses that tried to break the monotony of their high-stress nights. But one draft sat at the top of her unsent folder, time-stamped less than 24 hours before the night she vanished. The subject line read, "If anything happens to me." With a slow exhale, he clicked it open. With a disappear, the message began, "Look in the sub-basement beneath maintenance level 3. There's a door no one talks about beneath the old generator housing. Something's down there, something wrong. I've heard noises," and her name at the bottom. Rohr leaned back, the cold weight of dread growing behind his eyes. He printed a copy and filed it as evidence, then reached for the old blueprints of Central Crest. Maintenance Level 3 had long been repurposed, renamed, and relegated to records storage, but there, faint on the page, he traced a sealed stairwell marked Utility Shaft, Basement Access, Sector B. Most recent facility maps made no mention of it. He rubbed his temple, the lines in his forehead deepening. Why would Elena be near an old generator room? What had she seen down there? Across town, Delia Kim's mother, Neri, sat in her sunlit kitchen, her trembling hands cradling a chipped ceramic mug of barley tea. Her other hand held the picture of her daughter in scrubs, clipped from a recent hospital bulletin. The knock at the door startled her. It was Marissa Tran, Zoe's older sister. She held a printed copy of the unsent email. "Have you seen this?" she asked, breathless. Nari nodded slowly. "I worked there, in the 90S, before they sealed the sub." "Baxment." Marissa's eyes widened. "You mean the same one Alina mentioned?" Nari hesitated. "Back then it was a containment zone for medical waste and biohazards. We were told to never go down alone, but we all knew something wasn't right." Marissa sat down, disbelief washing over her. "Why was it closed?" Nari's voice dropped to a whisper. "April 16, 1999. One of the interns, Liam Keller, disappeared during a solo cleanup. No one ever found him. They sealed the level 2 days later. Officially, it was a gas leak." She glanced toward the hallway, where the floor creaked with memory. "Unofficially, we heard screams, even after the doors were welded shut." At the hospital, Detective Rohr called a meeting with the building's facilities supervisor, an aging man named Carl Hewitt, who had worked there nearly 40 years. When presented with the email and blueprints, Carl turned pale. "You're poking ghosts, Detective," he muttered. "That place was trouble even before Keller vanished." He reluctantly agreed to escort the team to the location mentioned by Elena, though his hands shook as he unlocked the rusted utility corridor that led down into darkness. The stairwell smelled of mildew and forgotten time. Every step echoed too long. They reached a sealed hatch marked with faded yellow caution tape. Carl tapped it with the butt of a flashlight. "This was welded shut in '99, but looks like someone's already been messing with it." Indeed, the lower hinge had been sawed halfway through. Rohr's assistant, Officer Bennett, documented everything while Rohr ran his gloved fingers along the groove of the cut. Someone wanted in, or out. Meanwhile, in her apartment, Nari opened an old metal filing box buried at the back of her closet. Inside were records from her nursing years, yellowing with age. Tucked among schedules and ID cards was a memo she'd always kept, unsigned, but with the hospital letterhead, Teresa, KFTA, and Webster 2 days after Liam Keller's disappearance. She showed it to Marissa. I always thought it was a cover-up, but we were young. We needed the job. Marissa scanned the memo and sent a picture to Detective Rohr's secure line. He received it just as his team pried open the bottom hatch. A blast of cold, chemical-scented air met them, along with complete darkness. They descended further, into a cavernous room cluttered with rusted medical equipment, gurneys with buckled legs, and shattered light fixtures. The air was thick, almost gelatinous, like the room itself was resisting them. Then, under a pile of plastic sheeting, Officer Bennett found something that made her breath catch, a bloodied ID badge, half covered in dust. It read, Zoe Tran Pediatrics. Rohr's flashlight darted across the walls. Etched in grime, in uneven lettering, someone had scrawled. She asked Marissa quietly. Like memories made of flesh? Marissa didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the image of the badge sent by Rohr. Zoe had always worn that ID clipped to her left side. The photo was the same, but the date printed on it, date of issue April 16, 2024, was impossible. It was issued 3 days after her disappearance. Neri felt the blood drain from her face. It's a loop, she whispered. Someone's trying to repeat 1999. Marissa stood, shaking her hand out to her, officers shaky, panic creeping into her spine. Then whatever happened to Liam, it's happening again. Officer Bennett called from the stairwell. Detective, you need to see this. Rohr followed her light to the far side of the chamber, where part of the wall had crumbled. Behind it was another door, smaller, metallic, and locked with a biometric scanner long dead. Above it, a word etched in red paint. Ovation, ovation. He didn't know yet what they were about to find, but even then, his instincts were screaming. This wasn't just about 3 missing women anymore. It was about something much older, something buried, something that was never meant to be found. The morning after the discovery in the sub-basement, a heavy rain rolled into Oak Run again, bringing with it a second collapse, not of memory, but of infrastructure. A pipe under the north wing of Central Crest burst just after 7:00 a.m., flooding part of the maintenance corridor and causing a sinkhole to form in the alley beside the west loading dock. Beneath the fractured concrete, buried under what appeared to be decades of sediment and forgotten materials, was a rusted metal door half covered by collapsed piping. It wasn't on any blueprint. Carl Hewitt, the old facility supervisor, was called once again. When he arrived, his face drained of color. That door wasn't meant to be found, he muttered, and when asked what it led to, he simply shook his head. Whatever's behind it, it's not on any record made after 2000. Detective Roy, already running on 2 hours of sleep and a cold coffee, ordered the site secured. His instincts told him this wasn't an isolated coincidence. This hospital was bleeding secrets. The engineering team brought in a crowbar and a portable hydraulic cutter. The door groaned as it gave way, rust flaking off like ash. A gust of stale metallic air hit them the moment it cracked open. It smelled of mold, ammonia, and something else, faintly sweet, like decay mixed with hospital antiseptic. Rohr held up his flash longer than expected, and unlike the rooms above, it was still intact, preserved in darkness. The walls were lined with outdated intercom panels, their cords hanging like vines. A small, faded sign above the next doorway read, Sub-Level C Experimental Diagnostics. No one had said those words aloud in over 20 years. As they moved deeper, the temperature dropped sharply. Officer Bennett, walking just behind Rohr, whispered, "Why is it colder down here than in the fridge unit?" No one answered. They reached a room marked Lab 4, where broken test tubes littered the floor and overturned carts lay covered in years of grime. A desk still held a discolored clipboard, with a patient chart that ended abruptly on April 16, 1999, the date that kept surfacing like a scar. It was Bennett who found the bracelet. She had been clearing debris near a collapsed storage rack when her glove brushed against something metallic. She knelt and pulled it from beneath a rusted cabinet leg. It was a medical alert bracelet, stained and nicked, the engraved letters dulled by time, but still legible. "Z," Harold said soundly, her voice echoing in the dead air. Rohr took it from her with gloved hands, holding it beneath the flashlight's beam. Blood had dried in the grooves. Not fresh, but not ancient either. And on the inside, there was a date of birth. It matched Zoe's. There was no doubt. The bracelet confirmed what they had feared. Zoe had been here, recently, and injured. Rar ordered a full forensic sweep of the corridor. Swabs were taken from the blood on the bracelet and surrounding floor, samples sealed and catalogued. Down the hall they found old IV stands, trash syringes, shattered vials labeled with faded barcodes. One broken panel on the wall revealed a camera lens long since dead, covered in cobwebs, but angled toward what appeared to be an operating table, fixed in place, its leather restraints cracked and frayed. It was a place meant to restrain, not heal. Bennett's voice trembled. This wasn't a lab, this was a holding facility. Back at the surface, Marissa Tran received the update with a mix of horror and grim satisfaction. She had told them Zoe hadn't just run away. Now there was proof. But Nari Kim was less surprised. She sat in silence, remembering things she had buried with the rest of her trauma. The late-night whispers, the sealed containers marked BOHA, ARD, with no patient ID. The orders to double glove, to never ask questions. She remembered a nurse named Elise who had transferred out a week before Liam disappeared. She had told Neri that the sub-level wasn't just for waste, it was a place where things were hidden. Elena's mother, Miriam Morse, received the call while visiting the church across from Central Crest. When she saw the photo of the bracelet, her knees buckled. She knew that bracelet. Elena had given it to Zoe for her 27th birthday, just 2 months before the disappearances. A simple stainless steel ID tag engraved at a kiosk in the mall. Z-tag, stronger than fear. That engraving was now half erased by rust and blood. Inside the lab corridor, the forensic team found drag marks in the dust, leading from the operating area toward a door that had been barricaded with steel bars from the outside. The door had no knob, only a rectangular slot near the bottom, like a pass-through. Somebody was kept here, Rourke murmured, and not just Zoe. He ordered the bars removed, and when the door was forced open, they found a small, windowless cell. The bed was bolted to the wall, the toilet was dry, stained with age. A chain bolted to the wall ended in a cuff, small, size for a wrist. And on the mattress, barely visible in the dim light, was a handprint in dried blood. Next to it lay a torn strip of pale green fabric, the kind used in surgical scrubs. Rohr took one step inside and froze. On the far wall, someone had scratched words into the plaster with what looked like a nail. "I remember who I was. Please remember me too?" The silence was suffocating. Outside, a shout rang through the corridor. One of the techs had found a second bracelet. This one was engraved E. May 3, 2024. That was tomorrow. Bennett stared at the object in her gloved hand. Why is there a bracelet dated for a day that hasn't happened yet? No one could answer. Detective Rohr stood in the center of the sub-level corridor, eyes locked on the bracelet dated for a day that hadn't yet come, and though the silence around him pressed heavy on his chest, his mind refused to be still. The walls whispered with every flicker of the overhead lights, as if the very foundation of Central Crest remembered things no one dared speak aloud. Officer Bennett, shaken but steady, continued collecting samples from the holding cell while the forensics team expanded their sweep beyond the immediate chamber. That's when one of the younger techs, a former intern named Bryce, stumbled upon an old metal storage cabinet partially hidden behind a toppled rack in the corner of Lab 6. The door was sealed with corrosion and dust, but Bryce managed to pry it open. Inside were stacks of outdated patient files, warped VHS tapes, and a single unmarked audio cassette tucked between folders that crumbled at the touch. It was a relic, yellowed plastic with one side cracked but intact enough to play. Back upstairs, Rohr had the tape transferred to a portable recorder in the department's AV lab. He didn't wait to review it later. As soon as the device clicked on and the wheels began to spin, static filled the room, followed by a faint voice, a woman, breathless and strained, speaking in urgent whispers. "If anyone finds this," she said, pausing as if listening for footsteps, "we're still here. They kept us, not for ransom, not for tests, for silence." We found out the truth. The message dissolved into static again, then a sharp exhale. "They said no one would believe us. They said they'd erase us. If you're listening, please, Don't let them bury this again. Rohr leaned back, jaw clenched. Timestamp? Bryce checked the reel. Labeled May 1999, the name scrawled faintly on the cassette's casing read, Elise Nellis had been a nurse, quiet, methodical, always alone during breaks. She had left suddenly, shortly after the sublevel was sealed. Neri had assumed she'd moved, or quit, but now she wasn't so sure. While Rohr and his team followed the new lead, Miriam Morse, restless and uneasy, returned to the archives room at Oak Run Public Library. She'd worked at Central Crest for 14 years and knew that some records, especially controversial ones, were more likely to survive in dusty boxes than digital databases. There, buried in microfiche reels from 1997 to 2000, she found what she was looking for. A medical board report, never digitized, detailing the suspension hearing of one Dr. Byron Velez, formerly head of the hospital's experimental diagnostics unit. The charge, unethical administration of psychoactive compounds on unconscious patients without consent. The result, suspension without prosecution. But the last page of the report had a stamp across it in red ink, sealed by Hospital Order 2001. Miriam copied the entire file and brought it directly to Detective Rohr. When he flipped through the pages, the name Velez hit like a thunderclap. He recognized it from a guest badge log from just 4 months ago. Dr. Byron Velez had visited Central Crest multiple times under consultant access. He wasn't officially on staff. In fact, his name didn't appear in any active directory, but building access logs showed his ID had been used in off hours, always near maintenance zones, sometimes during the exact shifts that Elena, Zoe, and Dahlia were working. Rohr called Carl Hewitt again and confronted him with the records. Carol didn't deny knowing Velez. He's a friend of the board, he admitted reluctantly, the kind of man you don't ask questions about. Back in the day, he ran that whole sub-level. Clinical trials, genetic mapping, neural suppression therapies, the kind of stuff that never saw daylight. We all heard stories, but no one wanted to lose their pension over it. He looked at Rua's regret. We all knew he had dirt on the board. That's why he was untouchable. Back in the sublevel, the forensic team unearthed a forgotten document shredder. Miraculously, it had jammed before finishing its job. Inside, they retrieved scraps of a memo dated just before the facility's shutdown. When pieced together, it read, all samples from Subject Series Z terminated. Transfer protocols for behavioral retention to begin Phase 2. Seen by V.V. Vellet. Access restricted to biometric clearance only. That was a handwritten note in red ink. Nellis is asking too many questions. Recommend early relocation. Rohr stared at the name. Nellis. Again. Later that evening, Marissa Tran received a package at her doorstep with no return address. Inside was a burned DVD, an old hospital badge that read, in the far left corner, almost cropped out, stood Elena Morse, not in scrubs but in a white lab coat. She looked younger, shockingly young. Too young. The date on the photo's back read August 2019. Marissa's hands shook. Elena had started nursing school in 2020. She took the package straight to Rohr, who examined the badge and photo. If this is real, he said slowly, then Elena wasn't just a nurse. He inserted the DVD into a secure player. The video was grainy, time-stamped 2022, showing what appeared to be a medical exam room. On screen, a male patient sat restrained in a chair, visibly drugged. A voice off camera asked a series of memory questions, then instructed the man to recite the hospital's code of conduct. The patient struggled, murmuring fragments. A second voice, female, entered the frame. Elena. She wore a sterile gown and held a clipboard. He's retaining more than expected, she said. Suggest we pause the protocol. Otherwise, retention becomes self-aware. The other voice replied, we don't stop with the class, ma'am. Rohr sat in stunned silence. If Elena had been part of the program, had she gone undercover? Or was she manipulated like so many others? Was her disappearance an abduction or a removal? Back in the corridor, Officer Bennett followed the trail of blood found near the cell wall to a second, concealed hatch. The hinge had been recently oiled. When opened, it revealed a spiral stairwell leading deeper underground. She radioed for backup, but her voice cracked. Sir, I think this goes below the sub-level. I think there's more. The discovery of the spiral stairwell shook Rohr more than he would admit. It wasn't just that there was another level beneath the already uncharted subfloor, it was that the hospital's very design, its skeleton, seemed built for concealment. As forensics prepared gear for descent, a courier arrived with another package addressed to Rohr, this time with a return address. Inside, wrapped in layers of newspaper and string, was a photograph sealed in a plastic sleeve. The photo was grainy but unmistakably taken in front of the old observation wing. Standing in the center was a much younger Dr. Byron Velez, arms crossed and smiling faintly. Around him, 3 young women in nurse uniforms stood with their hands clasped in front of them. What made Rohr freeze wasn't just the timestamp, June 1999, but the eerie resemblance these women bore to Elena, Zoe, and Dahlia. Not identical, but close enough to unsettle even the most grounded mind. Their faces held the same structures, even the same subtle expressions of tension behind professional smiles. He stared at the photo, then turned it over. Written in faint blue ink were 3 names: Eva Morstan, Zoe Tracketfield. Dahlia Moore murmured, "That's not possible," and yet here they were, near-perfect mirrors of the missing nurses, dated 25 years ago. He immediately contacted the return address. L. Havers turned out to be Lillian Havers, an 82-year-old former head nurse at Central Crest, who now resided in a small care facility on the edge of town. Reared Officer Bennett arrived. She was already waiting in the lobby, her weathered hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "I knew someone would come eventually," she said, her voice steady. "I've carried that photo for decades. Never showed it to anyone until now." Rohr laid the photo on the table between them. "Can you tell me who they were?" Havers glanced down, her eyes clouded with old guilt. "They were called the Echo Series," she said quietly. "Velez never used names, only designations. They weren't hired the normal way. They just appeared. No records, no applications. One day, they were part of staff." Bennett leaned in. "Why did you keep the photo?" Havers hesitated. "Because they vanished. All 3 of them. Same month, same week. No one asked questions. They said it was a transfer to another facility. But I knew better." She paused, then added, "That photo was taken 2 days before the last time anyone saw them. I didn't take it. Someone left it in my locker." Rohr's brow furrowed. "Why give it to you?" Havers shook her head. "Maybe because I was the only one who still cared." She went on to describe how, in late 1999, rumors had spread through the nursing staff about unauthorized procedures taking place in the observation wing. Some said Valescu was trying to map behavioral memory, make it heritable, that he believed certain traits, obedience, resilience, submission, could be passed down or replicated. Rohr felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Genetic engineering?" Havers shrugged. "Not exactly, more like behavioral cloning. Not the body, but the mind. The mannerisms. The learned patterns." She looked Rohr in the eye. "If what you're seeing now looks like a repeat, it's not a coincidence. It's replication." Meanwhile, at the forensic lab, the blood samples from the bracement marked Z returned a partial match, but not a full identity. The mitochondrial DNA was consistent with Zoe's family line, but there were anomalies. "It's as if we're looking at a sibling she never had," the technician explained. "Same maternal markers, same age, but too many variations for it to be her." The team ran a comparison against the 1999 hospital files Miriam Morse had found, specifically one labeled Z from the Echo series. The match was almost perfect. Rohr, reeling, returned to Havers with a direct question. "Do you believe those 3 girls were used to create others?" Havers looked away. Eyes moist. Security got tighter. More people started disappearing, quietly. Patients were transferred in the middle of the night. Staff reassigned without notice. I left the following year. At Central Crest, beneath the weight of decades, the hospital's mainframe server room offered up another clue. A hidden partition was discovered on a backup tape labeled simply R47. The file, once decrypted, contained patient logs marked Project Inherigan. Dates stretched from 1996 through 2023. Each log entry was paired with a subject photo, blurred, incomplete, many labeled ZD. Intermittently, Dr. Velez's digital signature appeared alongside dosage reports, neuromapping results, and personality benchmarks. The final entry, time-stamped 1 week before the current disappearances, read, subjects approaching behavioral convergence, observation phase ending, integration imminent. At that moment, Officer Bennett received a call from hospital security. A retired janitor named Harold Finn had walked in that morning, shaken and pale. He had worked the graveyard shift from 1997 to 2005. "I saw them," he told the guards. "Not the ones now, the ones before, in '99. Same faces, same eyes. I cleaned the observation wing before they shut it. Sometimes I heard laughing behind the walls, but no one was supposed to be there." Rohr interviewed Harold that evening, who recounted how he once followed a light through the corridor behind the morgue, only to find Dr. Velez standing in a sealed room, whispering to what he thought was a mirror. But the mirror blinked. "I thought I imagined it," Harold said, "until the night before the lockout, when I saw the 3 girls walking into the stairwell, one after the other, like they were sleepwalking." When asked why he never reported it, he said simply, "They told me if I opened my mouth, my wife wouldn't get her cancer meds." That's all it took. Back at the precinct, Rohr examined the echo soda once more. His fingers traced the edges. The resemblance was undeniable. He pulled up Alina's staff photo, then overlaid it with the face labeled Eva Morstan. The software gave an 89.3% facial structure match. When he repeated the test with Zoe and Dahlia, the results were similar. Not identical, not clones, but derivatives echoes. In that moment, something else occurred to him. What if Elena had known all along? What if the unsent email wasn't a warning, it was a trigger? Down in the corridor below, sub-level C, Officer Bennett descended the spiral stairwell with 2 armed backup officers, radios buzzing with static. They reached a reinforced metal door marked. While Officer Bennett and her team prepared to breach the door labeled Echo Ward, Level 0, Detective Rohr returned to the Central Crest administrative floor, where a new problem had emerged. Earlier that day, an IT technician flagged irregular access logs in the hospital's internal patient archive system, specifically the repeated deletion of files connected to behavioral assessments, neuropatterning data, and staff schedules linked to the now-defunct observation wing. The name attached to the digital footprint was Dr. Miriam Lowe, a recently hired psychiatrist assigned to the trauma unit. What struck Rohr as odd was that Dr. Lowe had only been on staff for 5 weeks, and most of her patients were unrelated to the echo investigation. When confronted, she didn't panic. Instead, she asked for the door to be closed, lowered her voice, and said, "You're getting close, too close, and they know it." Rohr stared at her, not yet ready to trust, but intrigued enough to listen. Dr. Lowe reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of printed logs she'd saved, copies of the records she had been accused of erasing. "These weren't deletions," she explained. "They were diversions. Every time someone accessed these files remotely, a duplicate node would ping another server. That server isn't on the hospital grid. It's off-site. I think someone's been monitoring all this from somewhere else and using me as the scapegoat." Rohr asked how she discovered this, and Lowe told him about a strange conversation she'd overheard on her second week, between 2 board members speaking in code about sequence progression and administrative containment. She'd traced the access to a local terminal used only at night by a security guard named Lyle Vargas. The name didn't mean anything to Rohr at first. Vargas was on the staff roster for 4 years, with glowing references and no red flags. But when they ran a fingerprint check against national records, the match stunned them. Lyle Vargas was an alias. His real name was Raul Velez, older brother of Dr. Biner Velez. 20 years ago, Raul had been arrested in Nevada for impersonating a registered nurse, having bluffed his way into working on sedated patients at a plastic surgical clinic. The charges were dropped due to lack of victim cooperation, but he disappeared shortly after, and now, here he was, hiding in plain sight at the very hospital where his brother had once ruled the hidden floors. Dr. Lowe confessed that she had been tracking Raul's activities ever since discovering inconsistencies in his patrol routes and surveillance notes. He never checked the camera rooms, she said, but he always logged activity near the morgue, the boiler shaft, and the observation wing. Always between 2:00 and 4:00, she added that, on one occasion, she'd seen him exiting the stairwell to sub-level C holding what appeared to be a sealed medication crate, labeled 17 suppression vial, a compound she had read about once in a banned pharmacological journal. rumored to suppress short-term memory and override stress-stricken resistance. That night, with the help of hospital security and Rohr's approval, Lowe set a trap. Using her own ID, she logged into a restricted terminal connected to the backup servers, then stepped away while a decoy camera loop played overhead. Within 12 minutes, Rohr, disguised as Vargas, entered the room and began typing commands into the console. Rohr and Officer Bennett waited until he sent the first file batch, then moved in. Rowell didn't resist. He merely looked at Rohr and said, "You're already too late," before requesting a lawyer. The interrogation that followed peeled back a layer of the conspiracy no one had yet understood. Rohr admitted to maintaining the secret infrastructure of Project Echo, including supply deliveries, environmental controls, and transfer of subjects to and from off-site holding. He claimed his brother had gone underground but was still active, and that the stairwell beneath sublevel C was only one access point. There were 3 others, hidden in plain sight around Oak Run, disguised as utility tunnels and derelict clinics. But what caught Rayal's insistence that Elena, Zoe, and Dahlia weren't taken? They were returned. When pressed on what that meant, Rohr laughed hollowly. "You think they're the first set? They're not. They're the final one. And they know it now." Meanwhile, Dr. Lowe was granted temporary access to the main record repository after it confirmed her innocence. There she found archived photos mislabeled and misfiled under non-existent departments. One showed a surgical room with 3 identical stretchers, each with initials carved into the metal frame. ZT, and another image showed Velez standing in front of a whiteboard. Diagrams behind him marked behavioral looping, cognitive imprime memory, and compliance trigger. The photos were undated, but based on equipment models and clothing, they appeared to be no more than 3 years old. As news of Raoul's identity spread through the hospital, staff became restless. Some had worked alongside him for years, never suspecting a thing. But others, mostly long-timers, began to whisper memories they had buried, strange deliveries that bypassed inventory, medical equipment requisitions that never matched patient loads, and rumors of ghost wards that changed location depending on who you asked. One nurse, Joanne Kendrick, came forward with a story from 2021 where she'd accidentally wandered into a restricted hallway and saw Elena speaking calmly to a man strapped to a gurney, reciting what sounded like lines from a psychological test. When she'd asked about it later, Elena laughed it off, but Joanne said it never left her Henry. Rohr compiled everything, Raw's confession, Lowe's documents, staff testimonies, and began preparing an emergency warrant to access all sealed areas below level 0. But the hospital board refused to sign off. They claimed the areas were decommissioned, unsafe, and potentially hazardous. Rohr knew stonewalling when he saw it. "They're scared," he told Bennett, "not of us, of exposure." Back in Raw's holding cell, he began to unravel. Days without his usual contact made him volatile. During a late-night check, he screamed from his bunk, "They can see through your eyes. That's why she's here. That's why they sent her back." When asked who "she" was, he laughed until he wept. "Echo doesn't forget. It watches." At that exact moment, Dr. Lowe, back in her temporary workspace, received an anonymous message on her secure line. The subject line read, "They're waking up." Attached was a still image from a camera marked Level 0 Echo Ward. In it, 3 women in hospital gowns stood in the middle of a stark white room. Their backs were turned, but the names stitched on their collars were visible. Elena, Zoe, Dahlia. Following the chilling image received by Dr. Lowe showing Elena, Zoe, and Dahlia standing silently in the Echo Ward, Detective Rohr immediately ordered a silent lockdown of Central Crest's sublevels. Rather than initiate a public breach that might provoke those monitoring the subjects or compromise the investigation, Rohr decided to isolate all data terminals connected to Level 0 and deploy a bioforensics unit to the off-site storage compound previously ignored, Building J7, known internally as the Biomix Archive, where old biological samples and experimental substances were kept in deep freeze for legal retention. Officer Bennett accompanied the forensics team and entered the compound at dawn, escorted by a nervous administrator who confessed that no one had requested access to this storage in over 6 years. As they stepped into the temperature-controlled interior, the thick scent of antiseptic mixed with ozone clung to the air, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like mechanical insects. The shelves were stacked with glass vials labeled in the old hospital code format: alphanumeric series, timestamps, batch codes, and in many cases, initials. One tray caught Bennett's attention immediately. Its label read, Subject ZED Series, Batch 4.3. Inside were 3 syringes containing a clear fluid tinged slightly pink, alongside sealed envelopes of documentation. What sent a chill down her spine was the 4th vial sitting at the edge of the tray, unlabeled, but with a pale blue ring at the base. It had been opened, then resealed. The lab tech running point ordered it for rapid analysis. 40 minutes later, the results stunned everyone present. The fluid showed traces of a synthetic neuroinhibitor compound known only from classified medical trials, designated as HX19, originally designed to erase traumatic memory in PTSD patients, but shelved after extreme side effects, including identity collapse, total amnesia, and catatonia. Mixed into the vial was a small but unmistakable sample of DNA. Female, late 20s, with 99.6% certainty matching the genetic profile of Elena Morse. Rohr reviewed the data from the hospital's old experimental logs and found multiple indirect references to HX19 alpha trials, none of which were ever officially recorded in the hospital's public documentation. The references were buried in ancillary footnotes, procurement orders for anesthetic stabilizers, and off-grid entries tagged someone who could explain what all of this really meant. That night, Rohr visited Professor Emeritus Calvin Reeve, a retired neurologist and former department head at Oak Run University Medical. Reeve had long since distanced himself from institutional medicine, having famously resigned in 2002 after whistleblowing about unapproved experiments taking place as research. When presented with the lab photos and fluid analysis, Reeve didn't flinch. H19, he said, the name like poison on his tongue. They tried to rename it so many times, theta-9, L-mem, tranquilite, but the compound never changed. It doesn't erase memory. It rips it out and replaces it with silence. A person can function, eat, walk, speak, but everything about their emotional core, why they do what they do, who they are, gets scrubbed clean. They become what we call white form. Rohr leaned in. What do you mean by white forms? Reeve's voice lowered. Patients who have been exposed to multiple cycles of HX19 begin to demonstrate extremely compliant behavior. No aggression, no questioning, like a blank canvas waiting for new commands. That's why it was deemed unethical, because it doesn't treat trauma. Manufactures obedience. Dr. Lowe, listening silently, asked the obvious question. Could someone be subjected to this and then restored? Reeve hesitated, then shook his head. Not fully. Maybe fragments resurface, but what returns is never whole. It's like reconstructing a book after burning half its pages. Back at the storage facility, the forensics team found another clue, an outdated computer terminal sealed in an environmental vault and still partially operational. The login required an alpha clearance code. Rohr used the credentials recovered from Ral Vels's devices. The desktop opened to a single program, Echo Calibration Suite. Inside, session logs appeared in 3 columns marked Z, E, and D. Each log included timestamps, drug dosages, response thresholds, and neural dampening curves. The last entry, dated only 4 days before the disappearance, read, Subject Z demonstrated elevated empathy and memory bleed. Recommend reintegration pause. Subject E showed elevated assertiveness. Requires recalibration. Subject D, stable. The implications became clear. Elysia, Zoe, and Dahlia weren't simply victims of kidnapping. They had been subjected to neurochemical conditioning designed to control personality traits, memory pathways, and behavioral autonomy. They were not just being observed, they were being sculpted. Rory reviewed cross-referenced grants and found that several experimental compounds used in Project Echo had been routed through independent research grants funded by shell organizations. One lead connected to a now-dissolved entity named Prometheus Clinical Group, whose board included a familiar name, Dr. Byron Velez. Ruhr followed the paper trail and discovered that Prometheus had received substantial private backing from an unknown trust located in Switzerland, with offshore routing shielding its true origin. Embedded in one financial statement was a payment marked Phase 4 Behavioral Transference Final Integration Units EMZD-D. He brought the data back to Professor Reeve, who paled as he read it. Phase 4, he whispered, was theoretical. It referred to the ability to not just suppress a subject's identity, but overwrite it, inputting curated behavior sets, learned skills, even emotional templates from archived data. Reeve added that the only known example where Phase 4 was even partially tested resulted in total cognitive collapse in lab animals. If they're applying it to humans now, they've crossed a line that no science should ever touch. Meanwhile, Dr. Lowe received another encrypted email, this time from a former Central Crest researcher who had vanished from academia in 2017. The message was brief. I saw your name in the audit logs. If you're reading this, they've begun integration. The echoes are waking, but they're not the ones you think. She forwarded the message to Rohr with a single line. What if Elena isn't the one trying to escape, but the one trying to contain what's inside her? Rohr stared at the screen, the unease in his chest growing. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place and the sinister scale of Project Echo unfolded, Detective Rohr turned his attention to past behavior logs and internal staff memos that might have indicated foreknowledge, acts of resistance, warnings unheeded, or attempts at whistleblowing silenced before they could reach the surface. He found one such memo buried in a flagged folder titled Incident Pharmacy/Level 2, owned by Dahlia Kim 3 weeks prior to her disappearance. In it, Dahlia had detailed an alarming pattern of missing controlled substances, specifically Schedule IV compounds known for inducing vivid hallucinations and dissociative episodes when taken in unauthorized doses. She had cross-referenced these discrepancies with shipment logs and found that certain vials had never reached the pharmacy's storage room, despite being signed for electronically. The paper trail ended at the surgical prep station near the sub-level elevators, a zone no longer actively monitored at night. The memo had been marked for review by hospital risk management but was never escalated. In fact, the digital timestamp showed it was deleted from the system 5 hours after submission. Rohr uncovered it only because of an offline backup stored in the device Dahlia used, a personal flash drive she kept on her locker keychain, found lodged in the drain during the initial sweep. Dr. Lowe, reading through Dahlia's findings, from route with many of the missing substances had neuroenhancing or reality-disrupting effects when paired with existing compounds like HX19. The combination could suppress critical reasoning, increase susceptibility to suggestion, and cause confusion between memory and perception. In the wrong hands, she explained, these drugs aren't about healing, they're about reprogramming. Meanwhile, Miriam Morse, still tormented by her daughter Alina's vanishing, revisited an old voicemail she had saved but never shared with police. It had been recorded late one evening, just 3 days before Alina disappeared. In the message, Zoe's voice could be heard in the background, laughing nervously, while Elena whispered urgently, "She says it's the same guy again, the motorcycle one. Keeps circling her street after shift. I told her to report it, but she says she can handle it. I don't think it's random anymore." The message ended abruptly, followed by silence. At the time, Miriam had chalked it up to workplace paranoia. Now that voice haunted her, like an echo refusing to fade. She shared the recording with Detective Rohr, who compared the timestamp and background audio with Zoe's last known movements. GPS pings from her phone showed she had taken a longer route home that night, likely trying to shake whoever was following her. Surveillance footage from a convenience store near her apartment, previously deemed unrelated, revealed a motorcycle parked across the street during the same time frame. The bike was distinctive, matte black with custom silver etching on the cape of a serpent eating its tail. That detail matched the motorcycle found abandoned near the subterraneous during the sewer collapse 2 weeks ago, now stored in the impound lot under case ID Echo 43. Rohr ordered a forensic sweep of the vehicle, which turned up partial fingerprints belonging to Raul Velez. More disturbingly, in the rear compartment, they found a set of forged ID badges, 2 empty syringes, and a burner phone with a single contact saved as Lumen. Text recovered from the phone suggested coordinated movement, pickup ready, compliant state confirmed, EM resistant. Delay integration, another message simply read, Z showed bleed, monitoring. Dr. Lowe interpreted the terminology as code for behavioral instability post-conditioning. Bleed means memory or personality is resurfacing. It's considered a failure in the subject's conversion. Zoe's mother, Marissa Tran, confirmed independently that her daughter had mentioned the same motorcycle at least 4 times in the weeks before she vanished. She said he never approached, never spoke, just watched, Marissa recalled, tears clouding her voice. She thought it was someone from a previous patient's family, maybe a stalker. I wish I'd taken it more seriously. When asked to describe him, Marissa could only recall Zoe's words. He looked like he didn't belong, like he was wearing skin that didn't fit right. As the threads drew tighter, Rohr and Lowe returned to the recovered session logs from Echo Ward. They found a chilling correlation. Each time Zoe exhibited memory bleed, a scheduled dose of HX19 was skipped. Instead, her sessions involved a different compound, noted only as L5. The records showed irregular reactions, noted dreaming, heightened awareness, even direct confrontations with technicians. In one note, a handler wrote, Z questioned calibration, may be aware of trial structure, sedation advised. It was becoming clear that Zoe had sensed the manipulation, and she wasn't alone. Dahlia's memo included screenshots from her desktop showing irregular night movement in the medical wing. One of the screenshots showed Elena, months before the disappearance, standing motionless in a hallway near the basement access, staring into the lens of a ceiling-mounted camera. The image was grainy, but Dahlia had written underneath it in red, "This is not the Elena I know." Ramittled. Rohr began to suspect that the 3 women weren't simply test subjects, but agents within the experiment, each responding differently to conditioning, memory suppression, and surveillance. While Zoe resisted quietly, Dahlia had become the anomaly, neither fully compliant nor entirely resistant. The final straw came from a recorded intercom transmission captured accidentally by a maintenance engineer running a diagnostic on level 2. The voice on the transmission, heavily distorted but clearly female, repeated a phrase 3 times. He is still here. He is watching, but not from above. The voice matched Zoe's vocal profile with 94% confidence despite being digitally altered. The timestamp placed the transmission at 3:42 a.m., 48 hours after her official disappearance. Dr. Lowe listened to the audio and turned pale. "They're trying to tell us something," she said quietly, "and I think they've been trying from the start." After the decoded intercom recording revealed a final plea cloaked in static, Detective Rohr and Dr. Lowe moved without delay, coordinating a discreet breach operation beneath Level 0. The hospital board, under pressure from a mounting body of evidence, finally relented, issuing temporary clearance for law enforcement and medical rescue teams to enter the Echo Ward. Armed with heat-mapping devices and neurosignal detectors, the response unit descended the spiral stairwell beneath the sub-bracement, pushing through rusted security doors and fiber-sealed partitions until they reached a corridor lined with smooth white walls, devoid of labels or fixtures. The ambient temperature dropped dramatically, and the closer they moved toward the farthest chamber, the more erratic the readings on their bioscanners became. At the end of the hall was a sealed door with no handle, only a retinal scanner and a touchpad that flickered once, then died. Officer Bennett bypassed it with a portable override module, and the lock disengaged with a hiss of vacuum pressure. The room beyond was stark white, sterile and soundless, an artificial silence that throbbed in the ears like pressure under water. The walls were seamless, the ceiling a panel of soft diffused light that gave no hint of source or shadow. In the center, 3 beds were bolted to the floor, each occupied by a woman strapped down with soft restraints, their limbs thin from atrophy, eyes closed, chests rising slowly. Daria Morris, Zoe Tran, and Dahlia Kim, emaciated but unmistakably alive. IV lines fed into their arms, delivering a constant trickle of saline and what appeared to be a sedative compound. The team rushed to their sides, checking pulses, loosening restraints, adjusting oxygen flow. Their bodies bore signs of long-term immobilization, bedsores, muscle wasting, and dehydration, yet their vitals were stable, barely clinging to the edge of life, but not lost. As Dr. Lowe worked alongside the medics, She noticed that each woman's arms had faint scars where injections had been administered repeatedly, and beneath their hospital gowns were dermal patches still active with neurosuppressants. These patches contained traces of HX-19, but also something new, an unknown compound marked V-Sync. Lowe removed one and placed it into a specimen tube for immediate analysis. Rohrer stepped back to take in the room. There were no cameras, no monitoring consoles, only a single vent in the corner from which soft air whispered. "This place wasn't just for storage," he muttered. "It was a human silencer." As the women were stabilized and prepared for transport, Ra received a call from Officer Bennett, who had uncovered a makeshift storage closet 1 floor above the echo ward. Inside, they found a plastic container filled with empty water bottles, rationed energy bars, and a logbook hidden beneath a crate of scrubs. The logbook was handwritten in all capital letters, the penmanship rough but legible. The entries began 6 months ago and detailed the day-by-day process of checking on the girls, as the writer called them. Day 1. They're still breathing. System says coma, but I saw Z's fingers twitch. Day 14. Swapped out the bad IV bag. Smelled off. E almost woke up, whispered something about stick. The final entry was dated 2 days before the breach. Day 179. They're slipping. Can't keep them stable much longer. If you find this, I tried. I really did. The last page was signed shakily with the name Marcus. Rohr remembered Marcus Alvarez, a night guard who vanished 6 months earlier, just days after the nurses' disappearances. At the time, his absence had been attributed to abandonment of duty. He had a minor record, mostly low-level offenses, and a history of odd behavior. Now, the pieces clicked into place. Marcus had discovered the chamber and, for reasons yet unknown, chosen not to report it, but to care for the women in secret, risking his own safety to keep them alive. A deeper search of the echo ward perimeter revealed a narrow shaft behind a hidden panel, just large enough for a man to crawl through. At its end was an access tunnel leading back toward the incinerator room near the old morgue, Marcus's last assigned patrol zone. Dr. Lowe speculated aloud that Marcus, once involved as a minor cog in the larger machine of Project Echo, had experienced a rupture, an awakening triggered by exposure to the very conditioning he was helping to enforce. Perhaps he had known Alina, Zoe, or Dahlia personally. Perhaps guilt had driven him, but whatever his motive, his actions had preserved their lives long enough for rescue. Back in the hospital, the ICU was cleared for the incoming patients. Elena, Zoe, and Dahlia were placed under strict observation, their sedatives flushed and replaced with balanced hydration and nutritional drips. Within 12 hours, neural activity began to rise. Brain scans showed erratic spikes in regions associated with long-term memory, emotional recall, and language processing. Dr. Lowe monitored the EEGs closely, her fingers clenched. "They're fighting their way back," she whispered. "Something inside them is still intact." Meanwhile, Rohrer met with forensic analysts who had begun decreasing more logs from the Echo suite. One file, tagged Resurgence Protocol, indicated that Phase 4 subjects exposed to long-term sedation were not expected to recover. If cognitive reconstitution occurs, the note warned, subject may exhibit identity convergence disorder or psychogenic fugue. Recontainment advised it. Rohrer read the final line twice. Subject E is particularly unstable. Monitor for signs of reintegration failure. At 2:17 a.m., Elena's eyes opened. The morning light pierced through the curtains of room 408 in Central Crest's west traxive wing, casting a golden hue over the white bedsheets and illuminating the gentle rise and fall of 3 figures long thought lost to silence. Nurses moved quietly around the perimeter, adjusting IVs and checking vitals, but the atmosphere within the room had shifted, less clinical, more sacred, as if time itself were holding its breath to witness what came next. Dr. Lowe stood in the corner, arms crossed tightly against her chest, watching the subtle signs of awareness return to the 3 women who had defied science, manipulation, and fate. Dahlia stirred first, her eyes fluttering open as if emerging from deep water, pupils dilating against the soft daylight, lashes trembling. Her gaze swept a ceiling before words could be spoken. Then Elena, Freya, as her mother had always called her, opened her eyes last. There was a moment where everything froze, where memory and confusion collided inside her fragile expression. And then she whispered the word no one in the room expected to hear. "Mom?" Miriam Morse, who had not left the hospital since the girls were recovered, rushed to her daughter's side, grasping her trembling hand with both of hers, tears falling freely. Freya's fingers closed around her mother's as she whispered through cracked lips. "I remembered your voice. I remembered the lullaby. I counted the footsteps in the hallway every night, hoping one of them would stop outside my door." Miriam sobbed as she kissed her daughter's forehead, unable to form words, only able to nod and repeat, "I'm here. I'm here." At that moment, Zoe reached over and placed her hand gently over Alina's wrist, then reached toward Dahlia, whose arm extended shakily. The three of them, once friends, now survivors of something none of them could yet describe, found themselves drawn into a fragile embrace across their adjacent beds, their arms linked, their touch anchoring them to a world they weren't sure still existed. Nurses stepped back respectfully, and even Dr. Lowe turned away to give them the dignity of reunion unobserved. A few moments later, Miriam pulled something from her bag, unwrapping it with delicate fingers that had clutched the object through every night of prayer, fear, and hope. It was the photo, creased, soft at the edges, its colors faded, but faces unmistakable. The three of them, standing arm in arm in their graduation uniforms, radiant in youth, proud of what they'd accomplished, unaware of what the world would demand from them in the years to come. Miriam laid it gently across Elena's lap. The girl's lips parted in a soundless gasp, her trembling fingers brushing the image as if afraid it might vanish. "We were so happy," she whispered, and Zoe nodded. Harold had no idea what was coming. Dahlia let out a broken laugh through her tears. "But we're still here, somehow." The room filled with silence again. Not empty this time, but heavy with the weight of survival and the echo of all the moments they thought they'd never see again. Outside the window, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks, and sunlight poured in freely, washing over their beds like a quiet miracle. A nurse entered with warm blankets, pausing only when she saw the girls awake, holding hands. She smiled, then stepped back without speaking. Elena leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, her eyes closing once more, this time not from sedation, but safety. Her voice was low, just above a whisper. "I'm afraid of what I forgot," she said. "But I'm more afraid of what I still remember." Dr. Lowe knelt beside her, resting a hand lightly on her arm. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said. "We'll help you remember the right things, the true ones." Behind her, Rohr stood with his notepad in hand, but he didn't write. He watched instead, committing this moment to memory. No report, no transcript, no investigation summary could ever capture what this meant, for the mothers, for the women, for the town that had been living under a silent lie for years. He had asked so many questions, unearthed so many buried truths, but here, in this quiet hospital room, he understood the only answer that mattered. They had been found. Hours passed, the sun rose higher and the room brightened. More family arrived. Isabel Mendez burst into tears upon seeing Zoe's eyes open. Leha Kim pressed her forehead against Dahlia's and whispered prayers in Korean. The girls spoke little, but their expressions said everything, the disorientation, the pain, the overwhelming gratitude. A chaplain entered and offered to pray, but no one needed words anymore. Their presence was the prayer. Outside, a small crowd had gathered in the courtyard, candles lit, hands joined. When the news had spread that the nurses were alive, people from every corner of Oak Run came to pay tribute. A sign was hung across the front of the hospital, "Welcome home." Another read, As night fell, the girls were moved to a private suite, where they could sleep side by side, as they had in college dorms, as they had during quiet nights after difficult shifts, as they had in silence across the walls of the Echo Ward. Now, reunited in light, they clung to each other not in fear, but in healing. Miriam stayed behind after the others had left. She placed the graduation photo back on the nightstand, adjusted Elena's blanket, and kissed her forehead once more. "You never stopped being my daughter," she whispered, "not even for a second." And for the first time in half a year, Elena Freya slept without counting footsteps. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more mysteries that leave a mark. Which moment hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know.